Hello and welcome to yet another A to Z Town Hall with Fee. My name is Julian Achelianos, but you can call me Z for short. I'm president of Foundation for Economic Education, and today we will be talking about the environment. The environment is a topic I care deeply about. I remember my first forays into environment was watching Captain Planet on a bootleg cable back in the newly independent country of Lithuania. And I think many of us free marketeers, or at least some of us who believe in personal freedom and free markets, have this idea that we like the environment, we love the environment, but we don't like the environmentalists or environmentalist policies so much. So, is there other things that we can say about the environment? Are there free market solutions to that? How do we take the discussion back from the left and bring it back to us? This is the kind of environmental topics we're going to be talking about today, and I have an excellent panel for you. I have Holly Fretwell, who is a Vice President of Outreach at Property and Environment Research Center, or also known as PERC. Hi, Holly.
Hello.
We have Randy Simmons, who is a Senior Fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center, Editor of Environmental Optimism of Elinor Ostrom, and is also in the Center for Growth and Opportunity, a professor in Utah State University. Hi, Randy.
Hello.
And we have Nick Loris, who is the Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow in Energy and Environmental Policy at the Heritage Foundation, obviously one of the largest and biggest think tanks in our space. Hi, Nick.
Hello.
So we have an excellent panel, we have an excellent audience. We have 558 people registered for this event, so you have a very large audience. Let's start with Holly. Holly, could you sort of, in very broad strokes, describe us what the free market environmental policy should look like, and what is it that you do at PERC?
Yes, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining. This is exciting. I am the Vice President of Outreach at PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center, and we are a think tank and a conservation organization. We're based in Bozeman, Montana, and we pride ourselves on being the Center for Free Market Environmentalism. That is, we seek private solutions to enhance environmental quality, which is not usually what we think of when we think about environmentalists and how environmentalists solve environmental problems. So to share our work with you and how we see the world, I want to start with a really important question, and that is, who owns the environment? Because if nobody owns the environment, but we can still all use it, we'll run into the tragedy of the commons. And we can consider our ocean fisheries as an example. Many of our ocean fisheries are collapsing because no one owns the fish until they're dead, right? No one fisher can exclude another, so each continues to catch more and more fish, and any fish left in the ocean are likely to be caught by another fisher. So no fisher has the incentive to conserve fish. So let's think about that from a private ownership perspective. And private ownership motivates people to take good care of what they own because owners benefit from adding value to their resources, and they lose when value declines. So think about how you care for a house, a car, or your bicycle when you own it versus if you rent it. Free market environmentalism actually applies the incentives that are driven by ownership to the environment. So let's go back to those ocean fisheries, and nations have exclusive management rights to the water and fish within 200 miles of their coast. Many countries regulate commercial fisheries by setting lengths or regulating lengths of season. As fish populations decline, the regulations tend to shorten the season. So we go from 8 months to 4 months to 3 months to a couple of weeks, maybe even to a couple of days where we can actually fish. But even then, the fisheries are often collapsing due to overfishing. So even with the shorter season, more fish are caught because no one fisher can exclude another. So shorter seasons mean that fishermen have to increase their productivity. They have to catch more fish in that shorter period of time so that they can still make a living. So they overinvest in their boats and in their nets and in their gear so that they can continue to catch more and more fish in less and less time. And one solution that we've come up with to try to resolve this overfishing of the oceans, at least within these owned zones, these national zones, is to create property rights to fish. Well, when you think about that, fish swim, right? So it's really hard to define a right to a certain fish. Instead, rights are defined to a percent of the sustainable catch. So fish populations are measured. The number required in the ocean to ensure a sustainable population is subtracted from that total population estimate, and the remaining fish are allocated for catch. Fish quotas have been successful at allowing fish populations to rebound while fishers can stay in business. And in fact, seasons have lengthened, reducing the risk and increasing the fish quality. The Alaskan halibut season, for example, was once as short as 2 days, twice a year, and it's now 8 months long. So free markets, for any good, environmental or not, work well to allocate resources when there's good information and secure property rights. So as we've continued in this discussion, I want everybody to be thinking about what a secure property right is. And there's a couple of key characteristics that we want to consider. One is that we know what we own. We know the boundaries. If we own a piece of land, we know where the boundaries are. Our neighbors agree on that. If you own a car, we all understand it's my car and I own the wheels and the steering wheel and everything else within that car. So we can define what that property right is, that it's defendable. We can enforce our rights. There's some repercussions for theft if somebody wants to steal our car or get on our property. And that can be either formal in the sense of police and courts that are helping enforce our rights, or it can be more informal, where we have some cultural norms and shaming that help motivate behavior. But a big piece of this is that we have the right to exclude others from using the resource. Otherwise, the tragedy of the commons results from the inability to exclude others, such as the fisheries example that we talked about. It's also really important that the owner can trade, lease, sell the resource or the use of the resource. So I used to have a piece of pasture land just outside of town, outside of Bozeman, and I don't have any horses. Horses are really high maintenance, I think, but I like to look at them. And I actually leased my land for others to put their horses in there. And then I realized by doing that, I could also make more money if I had a horse barn. So I actually built a horse barn that I never used, but it was in my best interest to create that horse barn because it made my property more valuable to other people. So I considered how other people wanted to use my property. And the final characteristic that's really important is that the owner is liable, that we're liable and accountable for harm done to others when we're using our resources. So if my horse manure is oozing on my neighbor's property, I need to be liable for that. I need to take care of that. And the neighbor can actually force me to stop if I have a clear, secure property right, or maybe we can negotiate and I can compensate the neighbor for putting up with a little bit of my pollution, if you will.
Well, let me put my leftist environmentalist hat on and sort of throw a couple of questions your way. Now, on one hand,
okay.
I completely understand the premise and I agree with that. Masterless things or things without someone to look after these tragedy of the commons. I get all that, but like I said, let me put on my leftist hat. So, I mean, how could we trust the market with taking care of such an important thing as environment when we have multiple examples of environmental failures? You have your dodos, you have your passenger pigeons, you have your whales, you have your snow leopards. If it wasn't for the government stepping in, those species would be wiped out. So how could we trust the market with such precious things as snow leopards and cute pandas?
Well, it's a really good question. And when you think about it, well, who owns the wildlife, right? That's why I started with who owns the environment. And if the state owns the wildlife, no one individual has the right to take care of it and exclude others from it. But we have some really creative solutions that are coming out where people are starting to figure out how to ensure that we have protected wildlife. Nature Conservancy is an example. We have shorebirds in California. They were concerned about the shorebirds disappearing, and the Nature Conservancy doesn't own the shorebird, and they don't own the land along the migration pathways, and they can't afford to own all that land. But what they did instead was they started purchasing leases from the landowners down there that are growing rice, and they flood their fields for a certain period of time. And they encourage those landowners to continue flooding their rice fields while the migration was taking place. So now we have the Nature Conservancy taking care of shorebirds, and they're doing that using the free market process. And it's because we have these tradable rights, even though they don't actually own the wildlife, but it's in their best interest to try to take care of them because that is what their goal is, and that's how people fund them, for taking care of wildlife and habitat.
Okay, we'll have more of these questions coming up. To those of you who are listening to us, there is a Q&A feature, so please submit your questions and we'll address them later. And if you can think of better questions like how do we privatize the whales, I mean, the floor will be yours. Okay, second, we have Randy Simmons, and I'm really intrigued by he says he's the editor of Environmental Optimism of Elinor Ostrom. And I'm really intrigued by that because if you look through, once again, if you look for what the left is saying, they're pretty much saying that Elinor Ostrom proved that capitalism is not necessary. Anyway, Randy, what are your thoughts on how we should have a nice and green environment and a free market?
I'll start with a quick story. I visited the Dominican Republic several years ago and went to an agency that basically manages all of the water, all of the irrigation water in the Dominican Republic. And they had this huge map on the wall, and they showed all of the dams that were built and all of the systems. And I said to them, so how are these being managed? And their response was, well, have you ever heard of Elinor Ostrom? I was a good friend with both Lynn and Vincent Ostrom, and so I said yes. And they explained that what they try and do is manage from the bottom up instead of the top down, using the principles that the Ostroms worked out for how people are able to manage resources and minimize conflict over them. The thing to remember about Lynn is that her dissertation was on groundwater in California, and looking at all of the institutions that were emerging to be able to manage that water. And it's what she really celebrated was the ability of people to think and to cooperate and to develop systems, incentives, forms of property rights, so that it was clear who owned what, who had what responsibilities, and what happened if you didn't carry out your responsibilities. So that's, I think she added a huge benefit to our understanding of how to manage, especially common pool resources. Second story is that one of my former students worked for Trout Unlimited. Now, Trout Unlimited is an organization of people who like to fish, and they want to make sure that there's plenty of good fishing. And they've done some marvelous things in Montana and in Oregon, where it turns out they're actually able to own water and leave it in the stream, or lease water and leave it in the stream, whereas in Utah, the only way you can own water is if you divert it from the stream. I know that there's a huge backstory to that, but if you leave the water in the stream, you lose the right to it. So this student of mine was working for Trout Unlimited, and there was a 50-mile stretch of the Bear River coming out of the Uinta Mountains that had no water in it most of the year because the irrigators owned the right to divert the entire stream. They would drive a cat up the river, drop the blade, push up the gravel, and have all the water go into their irrigation systems. And Trout Unlimited raised some money. They managed. It took them like 4 years of working with the government bureaucracy to get permission, but they changed the diversion point of that water almost 50 miles downstream, but still they brought it around the mountain and back to where the irrigators were. And it turns out that now that stream has water in it all year round, all the way down. So it's not just the fish, but in the aquatic life, but anything that comes and drinks out of that stream who benefit. And I was there with the attorney from Trout Unlimited, and I said to him, so is this an example of free market environmentalism? And he said, I don't know what that is. This is just environmentalism that works. And that wasn't, what they did is they recognized that the irrigators owned a right, had a clear right to divert the water. So given that they had that right, then it allowed them to work out a solution. Without having a clear right, then the only way you try and work it out is that you do what we would call political environmentalism and just see who had the best lobbyists and who could apply the most pressure on a legislature or a Congress and get things done their way, as opposed to a way that's cooperative along the lines of what the Ostroms would propose. So that's a great benefit I see to property rights in the environment. To answering Holly's question, who owns the environment, is if you do have clear property rights, then you can negotiate. If you don't have clear property rights, then you fight. And so I think that's the sort of the Holly started with who owns the environment, and that's a really, really important question, because societies work much better when people find ways to negotiate and cooperate as opposed to fight. When you negotiate and cooperate, you can both come out better off. When you fight, normally one person's gains is the other person's losses, and often you lose. What's lost is more than what is gained. Anyway, anytime that we can replace political action with cooperative action, I think that we're better off socially and we're better off environmentally. One of the questions that people ask is, well, what about externalities? I don't know that there's a really more destructive word in discussions of the environment than externality, because it's, as soon as you say externality, you're assigning blame to someone. Near where I live, there still is a dairy farm. It's a large dairy farm. They have fields where they raise their alfalfa and some of their grain, and it's a really picturesque view right there. And developers started buying up farmland around it and turning that farmland into subdivisions. And people first thought that was so wonderful to live next to the dairy farm, until it was time to cut and bale that hay. And the best time to bale hay is between 2 and 6 in the morning, and balers are loud. And then you get to September, and in September, cow manure has stacked up and it attracts flies. And people weren't even able to barbecue outside because of the flies that were attracted because of the dairy farm. And then in the fall, they take all of the slurry that's from the cow manure and spread it using sprinkler lines over their entire fields. Now imagine the smell of that. So flies and noise and stink. People look at that and say, well, that's an externality. But is it? Is it really an externality? And if it is, who created it? So we think of an externality as being a cost imposed on someone else without their permission. Before the subdivisions were there, the farmers were doing exactly the same thing they had been doing through time. And there wasn't an externality. But now that those people have come, it's an externality, and the farmer should have to change. Well, who's creating the externality? The people who came or the people who were already there? And if we think about situations like that, then we can say, well, who has the property right? And if someone does, for example, say the farmer has the right to spread the manure, to bale the hay late at night. If that's the case, then the people around there, if they want to change it, can go to the farmer and negotiate him changing his procedures, maybe helping purchase some different systems for him, but so that they're solving the problem together, as opposed to just going to court and saying he's an evil man, he's causing flies and stink.
Randy, we'll come back to that later. I think you have a very excellent example. It's one of those sort of Buddhism questions. If a farmer makes a stink and no one smells it, has pollution really happened? Right? We'll go back to these. We have a lot of questions, but now we have Nick, who is an energy and environmental policy at Heritage Foundation. So obviously, you guys have a really sort of high view of what's happening. So, is there a chance to have a free market environmentalism in the current system, or are we just talking to ourselves?
That's a great question. I think I come from it with both pessimism and optimism. There's good reasons to be pessimistic because especially now in COVID times, there's definitely a never let a crisis go to waste mentality that will continue to rely on rent seeking and using the political process to secure different types of subsidies for various energy sources based on environmental concerns. That there's also opportunities for increased amounts of regulations on specific industries based on environmental concerns. And so that posturing worries me. And you see it not just from the renewable energy sector, but you saw possibilities for oil bailouts as well, or tariffs on imported oil, and so moving backwards from markets. And so really my hope is that Congress and policymakers will first do no harm when it comes to energy and environment policy. And while it's very important to keep people tethered to their jobs, to save people's lives and protect public health and protect people's livelihoods, there's also a posturing for how do we set in place years worth of targeted tax credits for specific energy technologies that will last well beyond the pandemic. And that's problematic for a number of reasons. Not only is it a waste of taxpayer resources, but it fundamentally dictates who produces what. And so there's a huge opportunity cost there if there's resources and technologies and companies who aren't receiving preferential treatment from the government, they may miss out on securing those investments from private capital as more private capital is steered toward what the government thinks we should be producing. So that is the pessimist in me, especially if we saw kind of what happened in the 2008, 2009 recovery and the amount of money that went out the door to promote specific green technologies, and trying to use this opportunity in an era of low oil prices to somehow pivot toward climate change and climate policy. But I think there's also an optimist in me in that there are free market principles embedded in attempting to steer toward better energy and environmental policies, and that you've seen with regard to environmental review and permitting reforms. This is something that has frustrated both traditional energy technologies, whether it's oil and gas development or mining coal, but also wind and solar and nuclear technologies as well. These projects are held up in years of regulatory red tape. And if they finally get the permit, then they may go to court for years. And so this has been frustration that's been voiced by both conventional resources and renewable ones alike. And so if we can move toward more market-oriented reforms that are technology neutral and ensure that these technologies aren't held up in years of regulatory red tape, then we can make more positive reforms going forward. Another example is electricity choice in markets. If you look at a state like Texas, which if Texas were a country, it would be the fifth largest wind producer in the world. And part of that is because it's a big state. Part of it is because they are in a very geographically advantageous area to take advantage of wind, and they benefit from the wind production tax credit. So there are subsidies involved. But another part of it, which has been the envy of environmentalists and free marketeers alike, is that they have retail electricity choice. And in that instance, when you shop for an electricity provider, it's more like shopping for an Airbnb, where you can choose between a whole number of different categories based on your individual preferences. You can enter into shorter long-term contracts. You can purchase 100% renewable. So there's different choices based on consumers' needs. And I think that the more we can tap into that notion where energy and environment policy is more consumer-centric, then we'll continue to make progress. And I think what Holly and Randy underscored is exactly right. On the margin, the more we can create cooperation and harness the power of incentives, the better off we're all going to be. I remember when I was at a PERC seminar out in Bozeman a few years ago, Brian Yablonsky, who is the executive director at PERC, told a story about the Fish and Wildlife Service down there, where they were dealing with a very big problem of invasive species of lionfish, off their coast. And they tapped into incentives to empower divers who go down for permits for spiny lobsters, to catch those spiny lobsters, to say for every 10 lionfish you catch and kill, you'll get an additional permit for a spiny lobster, which are big and delicious. And so it's creating these incentives and these cooperations that allow for reducing the invasive species. And another great part of that story is now the Fish and Wildlife Service and the folks who are catching the invasive species and the lionfish are actually selling them to restaurants to eat. And so when you can find value in these things, I think that's really when you can lead to a lot of good environmental and economic results. And part of that is creating the power of incentives, but also creating value in conservation. And I think that's something that PERC has really demonstrated with their work on the Endangered Species Act as well. I remember reading way back when a lot of the environmental organizations were worried about the Endangered Species Act because it didn't yield the right incentive structure. They would say that if you find a lot of oil on your land or a valuable natural resources, all of a sudden the value of your land skyrockets. But if you find an endangered bird and you are harvesting timber, the value of that timber plummets. And so it creates this incentive for a shoot, shovel, and shut up mentality rather than harvesting the right incentives. And so the more we can create that cooperation amongst conservation programs, amongst both federal and state governments and with the private sector, that's really when we're going to create the best economic structure that will yield the best environmental results.
But isn't it the case, and especially when we talk about incentives, it's once again the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So obviously, for free marketeers like us, it seems that incentives would work out. But for people on the other side, they think that our incentive is pretty much exterminate every species ASAP, and then they hear incentives, they logically take through their mental state. They would just think we would deplete a sea of whales and fish and trees as soon as possible and have a massive parking lot all around the earth. Anyway, that was a rhetorical question. Let's go back to our viewer questions. And I should have kept silent about whales because the first question is for Holly. So Holly, how do we privatize the whales and other such animals?
I think we need to think about sort of the spectrum of markets and how it works. So we talk about free market solutions, and that's when we have really secure property rights. And when we're talking about the whales, this is international waters. We don't have really secure rights on it, but we do have new technologies now that we can actually think about tracking whales and tracing whales and knowing where they are. The hard part with something like the whales in the international waters is it is a tragedy of the commons. We can create different types of treaties and other things, but as long as we have international boundaries, it's much more difficult to enforce those. So it's a really good question. We don't have solid answers right now, but again, as we get new technologies that we're better able to create property rights on it, then we can start to resolve some of those issues. But as long as it's international waters, we are likely to see some tragedy of the commons take place until we can have better enforcement, and that both that enforcement and excludable characteristics of property rights are missing there.
So you want to tell me that, let's say, if Elon Musk and Bill Gates decided they want to buy each whale and just track them for the fun of it, they couldn't do that with today's technology?
I think they could do that with today's technology. They actually could track those whales. The problem is they would have to have ownership rights over everybody else in the world because they're not secure rights on our international waters. But you could imagine that somebody like Elon Musk with a lot of money would say to Japan or whoever else is out there maybe coming to, that some of their fishers are coming to get those whales, that we will actually compensate you to not hunt these whales. And if we have a clear right, if we knew that Elon Musk owned them, then nobody else would have the right to actually kill those whales. If we said, maybe it's the fishers that actually own those whales, somebody in particular, then we could actually make the negotiation the other way and say, we will actually compensate you to not kill those whales so that we can make sure that they stay in the ocean. And that cooperative outcome or that cooperative ability to negotiate is where the free markets really come in. But again, when we're looking at an expansive international waterway where we do have a tragedy of the commons, it's a really, really difficult situation. And the questions are very real as to how we make that happen, either for free markets or for governments, right? I don't think that the political answers have resolved that issue either.
Okay, Randy, there's a question. There's a question to you. How do we solve the problems of dealing with predators like wolves, specifically the problems with the drop in wolf populations in Alaska?
Specifically with the drop of wolf populations in Alaska?
Yes. Yeah, so the question is probably, so sure, there are like nice animals like, I guess, cows and pandas that chew bamboo, and bamboo is kind of there for everyone. But then you have wolves that come in and take livestock, and that's where, the predator rights and property rights seem to clash, or do they not?
Well, a person who's had a long history of working with PERC actually came up with an approach that has great possibilities. The problem is what happens when it runs against political barriers. But his name is Hank, and Hank is someone who, for some reason, really loves the idea of there being large predators wandering around in the mountains in the western United States. And he would go around and talk with people about reintroducing wolves and why it was so important. And he said that he was at a meeting of a bunch of ranchers in Ashton, Idaho. And as he walked in, one of the ranchers said to him, "Hank, hasn't anybody killed you yet?" Feelings were actually fairly high. But Hank said he walked away from that meeting realizing that he was wanting something that was going to make those ranchers all worse off, because wolves would be predators on the sheep and the cattle that graze in those mountains. So he came up with the idea of a fund that would be used to compensate ranchers for the animals that they lost. So the ranchers would be no worse off. They'd get compensated if a cow or calf was killed by a wolf. There's the verification problem. You have to have a veterinarian confirm, yep, that was killed by a wolf. And he helped raise a fund with Defenders of Wildlife to do that compensation, so that in that case, ranchers, instead of being made worse off by Hank and his friends in the environmental community raised the money and acted as if they owned the wolves, in the sense that they were willing to pay the costs that the wolves were imposing on the ranchers. So a very private approach. And when I said the politics of it, eventually the politics at Defenders of Wildlife has stopped doing those kind of reimbursements. And people are asking the states to do reimbursements, and maybe that's a good way to do it. But if we're talking about Alaska, wolves aren't even close to being endangered in Alaska. They're not at all. So it's not that we have a problem, other than it might a problem of the other problems may be problems of perception, but there's lots of wolves in Alaska, and they're not close to being endangered.
Interesting. So that mechanism you mentioned, that reminds me of some stories from Europe where bears are barely there, or if they are, they're endangered. And I think if the bear gets into your beehives in a kind of the Winnie the Pooh manner, and if bears destroy beehives, the government compensates for the beehives, because it's the government that apparently owns the endangered species. Okay, it's interesting. Okay, question for Nick, but then for everyone as well. So, one of our listeners says, "I accept that virtually everything can be privately owned. It seems more problematic with the atmosphere, as the actions of one country can negatively affect another country." Can you speak to this, Nick, and then both of you?
Oh yeah, it's a tricky one for sure. You certainly have free rider effects on attempting to reduce harmful pollution in the atmosphere. I think some of those challenges are more easily solved than others, and I think it gets back to what Holly said in the beginning: is that if you define a problem and want to understand what the solution should look like, and can understand that the benefits of reducing that pollution or pollutant will outweigh the cost of doing so, then what is the best mechanism to do so? I think you've seen cap and trade trading systems work for things like acid rain that worked particularly well. You've seen even with the Montreal Protocol, I think with the impact on the ozone layer, treaties can in some senses work okay. I think with something like CO2 emissions and climate change, it becomes very difficult for a number of reasons. I think framing the problem is very complicated. Despite the fact that we know that human greenhouse gas emissions are impacting the climate and warming the planet, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what a doubling of greenhouse gas emissions will look like for future warming. There's a lot of uncertainty as to what natural variation and natural variability in the climate will look like. And there's also, again, a good reason for a lot of countries to prioritize economic development over reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so even if the US were to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions down to zero, whether you think climate change is a big problem or not, you're only talking about mitigating global temperatures a few tenths or maybe a few hundredths of a degree Celsius by the turn of the century. So again, I think defining the problem is important. And then in terms of what outcome you want to achieve, looking at what is the best system in place, which again might be actually, establishing property rights where they don't exist.
Okay, same question to Holly and Randy. I mean, the examples we talked about are kind of small scale things like a stream perhaps or some wolves in some places. But yes, what do we do about these really large cross-border problems? Is that where the government should get involved?
There's no question that those are more difficult problems, such as the whales, because we're looking at international problems that cross boundaries rather than something where we can create a fairly small property right for an individual to actually take care of things. But what we actually see with the private sector is that in wealthy countries, we are moving in that direction. We see companies such as Starbucks and Amazon creating these goals to be net neutral in 10, 20, 30 years, trying to reduce those carbons. And that's based on their reputation, right? They see that individuals, their consumers, are interested in reducing emissions. And so they say, we're going to make a goal to help reduce those emissions. And you're actually seeing that take place. One of the problems I see when we look on the sort of at the political environmental, as Randy called it, or look to the government to solve these problems, is the government is then choosing the winners and losers, which may or may not be the best technologies to get us somewhere. And oftentimes that's making other countries poor or keeping them poor instead of increasing their wealth. And we do know that as we increase our wealth in developing countries and in the developed countries, at first we may see some increased emissions and increased pollution until people can actually pay their way, right? They can buy food, they can pay for clothing, they can pay for their housing. And then once we have that security, we see a shift where we're actually seeing increased environmental quality. So if we're going to be reducing people's prosperity, we're also likely to see more environmental problems instead of less environmental problems. So we need to be very careful and always think about compared to what? The environment, protecting the environment through free market solutions is not always perfect, but the government solutions are certainly not perfect either, and they often have unintended consequences.
Randy, your take on this?
I believe some interesting work has been done at PERC in the last couple of years on the question of adaptation versus prevention. And I also, out of the group in Copenhagen, there's work along those lines. And it may be that given that the political problems are almost insurmountable for something like climate change, that the best thing that can be done is to work on ways to adapt. I mean, remember, the Netherlands is below sea level, and they adapted to that a long time ago. And I'm not trying to say there isn't a problem, but I'm saying that it may be that that's our best solution, is to adapt to changes in climate as they happen or as we are expecting them to happen, and get on with lives as opposed to trying to destroy huge segments of the economy in order to get I mean, if you look at the proposals for what we should be doing and how costly they are and what we're going to get out of them, we're going to get nearly nothing while spending trillions of dollars, and we'd be a lot better off. Every one of us individually would be better off if those trillions of dollars, some of those trillions, some fraction of them, were spent on helping us find ways to adapt.
Okay.
If I could just quickly add on to that, Amy Harder at Axios had a column on Earth Day. So if you go back and look at her Twitter account from April 20th, she had a chart from Carbon Brief, which showed the CO2 emissions that we've experienced during the pandemic. And that trajectory in just these 2 short months is effectively what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the folks who want us to keep warming at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels want us to be at over the next 10 years. So to Randy's point, I think you have to ask at what cost. And again, that's assuming their models are correct. But I mean, we've essentially shut down the livelihoods of people all over the world. From personal standpoints, to people missing high school graduations and proms and college graduations, to people's livelihoods being destroyed in terms of lost business activity. So all of the lack of traveling, the lack of air travel, we'd have to continue that over the next 10 years effectively to meet the emissions trajectory that they would want us to be on. And those measures would be draconian and make us so much worse off than we otherwise would be.
Okay, well, let me be a strict sort of pundit and say, well, you guys are skirting the question. The question was, how do we protect the environment in free market terms? And now you're saying, should we? So let me be realistic and say, okay. So imagine there is a government here. There's a lot of politicians who want to do free market environmentalism. So there is a question from the viewer: what are the mechanisms of enforcing private environmental property rights? Give us some example. Is it just cap and trade? Is it privatizing the whales? Is it like this Randy's story about insurance fund that compensates the damage that wolves do in a certain area? Are there sort of more practical examples of free market environmental property rights working successfully?
I want to bring you back to I started to talk about a market spectrum, and we can look at free markets where we have really secure property rights, and that's where markets work really well. We can do the Nature Conservancy story even when property rights aren't really secure on wildlife and the land, but we can allow for this trade and this negotiation. But then if we can't actually define those property rights very well, we can move down the spectrum a little bit and say, well, what about market-based solutions? And the fisheries is actually a market-based solution where we had tradable quotas. It's a cap and trade type solution. So essentially you have government coming in or some governing agency coming in and saying, here's the cap, here's the amount that you're allowed to produce, the amount of fish you're allowed to catch, or maybe the amount of emissions you're allowed to emit out of your factory, whatever it is. And then we're allowing that to trade. And from there, if you still can't get some sort of property rights, you fall down into taxes and subsidies and more heavy-handed government regulation. But again, if we can stay over sort of the market-based type of thing, we get this trade that takes place. And we've had cap and trade on emissions, and we talked about the fisheries that are successful, but it's not always easy, especially when we're looking at those bigger problems, sort of those international boundaries. But I think thinking about what that spectrum is and what characteristics of those property rights we have is really key to understanding how free markets are going to work and if they're going to work for that particular environmental problem.
Okay, anyone else wants to defend the practical aspects of this?
Sure. I think that we often fail to seek private or voluntary solutions because government exists. I was mayor of a small town, and I would get phone calls from people saying, my neighbor's dog is barking. And my response was, well, have you talked to your neighbor? And what I was told was, well, no, I don't want to make my neighbor mad at me. Well, because there was a mayor to call, they called the mayor, as opposed to figuring out a simple neighborly solution. We had a dog in our neighborhood that some new people moved in, and they brought a very loud dog with them. And it barked at all hours of the night. And my brother went and purchased a shock collar for training dogs to not bark and took it to their house and said, "Would you mind if we put this on your dog?" And worked with them to train the dog, and it completely solved the problem. There's a whole bunch of, and when we say free market environmentalism, we might want to just think about voluntary solutions to environmental problems. And people can find those solutions if they, if something else doesn't get in the way, like having the fact that there's a mayor that you can call. And that was one of the Ostrom's points, is that you've got people living in places where that you would not expect that they could come up with solutions, and in fact they do. They find solutions to fisheries with really primitive technology. They find people in the Alps have been grazing cows communally for 1,000 years. There are just so many. There's just a lot that can be done if we don't automatically default to say, "Oh, the government's got to fix that."
Okay. Okay, let me jump to another question, and feel free to throw in these practical examples if we have them. There's a question which I think deals with the shortage of water, and says, could you subsidize a stream or a river so that there are rights to a certain amount of irrigation, drinking water, fishing, or industrial water? Anyone?
Yes, we do. We don't subsidize, but in the Western United States, we have a very different way of managing water than in the Eastern United States. In the Western United States, it's all based on a set of property rights, and some people have a right to divert water to irrigate, others for municipal purposes, others for industrial. And what's happened in the last 20 years or so is that environmental rights have been recognized, but these are environmental rights that are owned by somebody, as opposed to just the state legislature saying, "Oh, you have to leave X amount of water in this stream to protect these fish." People can own an in-stream flow. Again, except in Utah, because I'm sad to say the state legislature believes that the only people who should own an in-stream flow, water that's left in the stream, is the State Division of Wildlife Resources, as opposed to allowing private groups to do it. But there's an amazing set of rights that people then can trade. The trick is there are some institutional, some legal impediments that make it difficult to move water from, say, farming to municipal. And until we get those impediments out of the way, it's going to be difficult to actually have those rights, those water rights, moved. When I was mayor, it took us nearly 3 years to move a right for water water that was in a stream 15 miles north of us to be able to use that same amount of water out of a well where we are, and there was no physical reason to not do it. It was just all political reasons, people fighting over that. So, but in the West, about between 75 and 80% of the water is owned by the agricultural community, and it can move to municipal and industrial and environmental if we have the right rules in place. In some places there are good rules, and in other states they're not. But the water is all managed by the states.
Okay. Speaking of government, there's a question for Nick. Let me rephrase a little bit, but the point would be, if we got rid of some of the environmental impact survey laws, wouldn't that bring positive changes in terms of economy, development, and environment would be just fine?
Yeah, I think it would be both, honestly. If you look, it's effectively disincentivizing new technologies from reaching the market. And again, that could be renewable technologies, that could be nuclear technologies. A good example is looking at the National Environmental Policy Act, which is affects a lot of our public works projects, highways, roads. So you could effectively relieve some congestion and reduce some of the emissions that occur as a result of increased congestion. you could allow new investments in companies outside of energy technologies, especially if we reformed both our tax and environmental laws. And I think that the real fundamental problem is, if you look at what our environmental laws have evolved to become, it's not to ensure that the project is environmentally safe and protects public health and safety. They've essentially been used as a tool to stop all sorts of projects. And just because we reform or got rid of NEPA doesn't mean these projects would actually wouldn't go through any environmental review or permitting process. It would just be to ensure that they are done safely and actually protect the environment. But now, if you just are allowed to tie up these projects in court, you're essentially going to drain some of these smaller companies dry for the amount of resources that they have to spend to fight these projects in court. The Keystone XL pipeline is another good example where transporting oil by pipeline is by far the safest way to do so, and yet the government gets to make what's called a national interest determination to determine whether or not this project is in our national interest. And that's, again, evolved into governments making these decisions about the viability of a project without really even considering that the project is environmentally safe. So again, reforming our environmental laws, and they're long overdue for reform, both the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, doesn't mean it's going to be the Wild West out there with no types of enforcement, or the fact that we don't have courts to ensure that if there is any type of harm or pollution that it incurs on someone's property, that there won't be a system to compensate for that, or to ensure that companies are held liable for the environmental damages that they cause. But it will allow more innovative, emissions-free, or more efficient technologies to reach the marketplace.
Well, I wish we had a separate A to Z town hall about Wild West, because I think we need a whole education of what Wild West was really like, because I think most people, at least in Europe, they just read Karl May, who never ventured beyond New York, and this is their imagination of what Wild West is. We're moving towards the end of it, so I have two sort of questions which I think we can sort of string into one. One, for you, don't you think that some environmental concern stem from the thinking that free markets would take too much time to correct and regulate before the solution would happen? Basically, I even though I'm a free marketeer, I understand that some people would say, well, perhaps free market would come to a solution in 500 years or 100 years, but that would be too late. Would be perhaps right now free market knows how to deal with dodo, but it was too little, too late, and now the dodo is gone. So therefore government. So there's that one question for you. And the second question, a more sort of step back, holistic question: why should we care about this? In other words, don't we have enough issues right now to care about the environment? And even if we do care about the environment, it's the government that pretty much has been taking care of it for the past 100 years, 50 years. So is this all talk about free market environmentalism and how to take care of the environment? Maybe it's just some sort of fun to talk about, but wouldn't really lead to any real solutions. So feel free to tackle any of these questions. Is there a point to this conversation? And don't you think that some people might think that free market just is too slow to correct?
I'd like to start us off, and then I'm sure that the other panelists have some great responses as well. But I want to start off talking a little bit about the common law. Common law is the law that we use here in the United States. We still have common law, but our environmental policies have sort of taken over the common law. But what the common law did for us was it cleaned our air and it cleaned our water long before we had the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Because the common law, it ensures that we have accountability, that we are liable for any harm done. So even if you have a pulp factory upstream and that's hiring hundreds of people and making millions of dollars, but you have a small farmer downstream, and the farmer downstream can demonstrate that he's being damaged and his property are being damaged and his cows or his trees are being damaged, then the courts tend to side with the person that's being damaged, because we are supposed to be accountable for damage done. And you might say that that's, we have to do that for every single activity, but we don't, because as soon as that precedent is set, other firms realize that it's going to be really costly for them to pollute enough that somebody complains. And so we actually saw that our air was getting cleaner and our water was getting cleaner, again, before the Clean Air Act and before the Environmental Protection Agency. So I do think that free markets have done a lot for us and can continue to do a lot for us. And we should care because government is not necessarily doing a very good job.
All right, Randy?
I'll take off from what Holly was saying. It's useful to remember that when we say free markets, we're not saying there's no government. We're saying that there's a system of legally recognized property rights and a court system to help enforce and defend them. And that's why Hollywood's talking about the common law. And the common law was doing a actually really great job. The rate of improvement in air quality and water quality actually slowed after the passage of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. So we had a system that was making things better. Now the question is, how long does it take? I don't know that we have any good data on government being faster than markets, although there is the perception that you pass a law and suddenly, okay, things are good because we passed a law. And what often happens is, actually, this is a story that, or example that one of the former Chicago economist George Stigler used. He said that people look at markets and say, oh, they aren't perfect. They don't solve all of our problems, especially as quickly as we would like to see. And so it's as if you have a singing contest with two contestants, and the first one is the market, and that contestant comes in and sings, and it's horrible. And so then you just give the award to the second contestant without even hearing that contestant sing. In all likelihood, it's going to be worse. And when Ronald Coase, who was a Nobel Prize winner and edited a policy journal out of the University of Chicago, said that every policy that they examined in the articles in the journal turned out to make things worse, not better. But we have the impression that because there's a law, things are better.
Nick?
Yeah, I'm sorry for disparaging my Western colleagues by saying the Wild West in a negative light. But yeah, I completely agree. I think people talk about market failures a lot, and I think there's this people have enough economics to be dangerous. And what I mean by that is, everyone takes an Econ 101 class. They know the supply and demand curve. They see the social cost and the market failure and the externality, and they talk about taxes and regulation to correct for it. And that's kind of where the conversation stops. And it's a convincing for companies who are trying to game the system for their own political preference, when the conversation of government failure just doesn't enter the conversation at all. And I think our skepticism is well-founded, because in a lot of these instances, the government has done a lot more harm than good, and instead of yielding progress, has created a set of incentives to allow for using the political system for their own gain rather than the gain of the overall economy or the overall environment. And so I think that this isn't just a fun ideological discussion. I think, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, that we all care and love the environment. It's just that we believe this is a fundamentally more important and effective means to that end and to yielding those results. And I think thinking about the future is also important, because there are things we should be addressing now. We also should recognize that we are vastly wealthier and more innovative today than we were 100 years ago. So thinking about what types of innovations and wealth we'll have in 100 years or 500 years is unfathomable. And we don't want to set that back through costly, ineffective regulations that inhibit innovation to ensure that consumer preferences for all sorts of environmental priorities that people may have, whether it's an endangered species or climate change, are inhibited from pursuing those types of goals.
Right, and then you mentioned government failure. I could go on, and perhaps we need another webinar. But I had the misfortune of growing up on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and let me tell you that everything belongs to the government. There is no environmental regulation. If you wanted to look for the most outrageous sort of environmental catastrophes, all of them are in the former Soviet Union. As an example, I mean, you've probably seen these pictures of ships rusting in the desert, and you're thinking, how on earth did those ships get there? And that's, of course, is an example of the Aral Sea, the entire inland, huge freshwater lake that was drained by Soviets diverting water to irrigate the cotton fields. And I don't even want to touch Chernobyl. But if you want to see government failure of government managing the environment, sort of go back in time to Soviet Union and you'll see what it's like. Anyway, I'm sorry, but we need to sort of wrap up. Let me share one thing. Many people sometimes ask, Z, what's the point of doing all this? And are people listening? So I just looked at some very interesting metric. So overall, the number of young people and the number of people we are reaching, so since January, it's gone up by 93%. Meaning we at FEE have actually doubled our audience in the past 4 months. So I think that's a good example of that people are listening in. They're listening in to this, they're listening to our YouTube, they're listening to our social media, FEE.org. These are all excellent channels. Now, if any one of you want to talk more about market environmentalism, feel free to reach out to Holly Fretwell and Randy Simmons, both from Property and Environment Research Center, or PERC. And if you have some ideas how to reform Washington, I'm sure Nick Loris from Heritage Foundation is more than looking for your ideas. Thank you for being with us, and I shall meet you next Monday, where we're going to be talking about market urbanism with folks from Mercatus and Pacific Legal Foundation.